Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in. It's wonderful to have you with us today. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Canada. Welcome to this webinar on critical minerals, Canada, and the 21st century economy. This issue has percolated up to the top over the last couple of years. It's become a matter of great urgency. As we particularly sort of understand better the relationship between critical minerals, a whole set of very important sort of mineral products, and the 21st century economy. This is not just about minerals in the traditional way. It's about minerals connected with all of the sort of major elements of a renewable resource economy, of a whole series of sort of high-tech developments, everything from electronic vehicles to computers and technology and what have you. We're joined today with four very distinguished participants, and I'm going to welcome them all in turn. Mary Scott Greenwood is the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian American Business Council. She's a major contributor on discussions in Canada and the United States on trade, investment, and the natural resource economy. We're joined as well today by Dirk Neumann, who is the President and CEO of Torngat. He has a wonderful and excellent distinguished career in Germany and around the world as a specialist in rare earth minerals with a very strong interest and engagement here in Canada. Heather Exner-Perot is a Macdonald-Laurier Institute Fellow. She is one of our many experts at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, but is a real specialist on Arctic affairs and on natural resource development in Western Canada and Canada as a whole, and also on Indigenous issues. So welcome, Heather, as well. And we have Dwayne Menzies joining us. Dwayne is a wonderfully eclectic and brilliant individual who has a resume that sort of goes badly off in all directions, but in beautifully coherent belief in social justice and strong international engagement. He is the founder and managing director of Polar Research and Policy Initiative, based in London. He's actually in London today. I've been on different sessions with Dwayne over the last couple of years, and he's always been on different continents, and never Antarctica, but I'm sure that's coming in due course, Dwayne. So these are wonderful speakers. Let me just quickly explain the format for today. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to give us introductory comments, probably around 5 minutes or so. They're going to go in turn. Scotty Greenwood is actually not able to join us in person, so her contribution is going to be recorded, and we'll go to that very shortly. When we're finished that session, everybody's had a turn to get their introductory comments. I'm going to ask a series of moderated questions to our panelists. I'm going to direct each one of the questions to one of our speakers, and the others may choose to follow up if there's information they want to add or contributions they want to make. At the end of that session, we'll probably leave about half an hour for questions from the audience. So I invite you in the chat function on your system to please send in any questions that you have. We won't necessarily have a chance to get through them all, but we'll make a really good shot at it, and we'll make sure that our panelists see the other questions for answering in later formats. So welcome very much to everybody for being with us today. Our panelists, this is going to be a great session. And I'd love to introduce in the first instance, Mary Scott Greenwood, or Scotty Greenwood, Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian American Trade Business Council, who's going to make her introductory observations.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I'm not with you live on the live stream, or better yet in person, but I guess video will have to do for now. I'm really thrilled that you are talking about the issue of critical minerals and rare earths, because it's a topic that is really important to the Canadian American Business Council, important to our economy, important to our security, and to the world. So we know that Canada and the United States have a memorandum of understanding about collaborating on critical minerals and rare earths. But like so many intergovernmental agreements, it's moving at the pace of government. So we're a little bit impatient for progress, and we think there's a good path. But let me step back for a second. Let's talk about critical minerals and rare earths are elements that are found not only in solar panels and are used in electric vehicle batteries, but also in our iPhones and so many of our consumer goods. Also importantly, they're used in defense goods. So precision guided munitions is one example that uses the materials quite a lot. And so they're quite ubiquitous in so many of our products in the world today. Here's the thing. China, and they're found everywhere in the world, okay? But China has the market on 80% of the processing of critical minerals and rare earths. So the whole world is beholden to China. Our supply chains are completely beholden to China because it has such a powerful market share. And not only that, but we know what the environmental rigor and the labor rigor is in China. It is not the same as Canadian and American values. So we have a proposition. Canada is so darn good at figuring out how to extract resources in an environmentally responsible way. Canada has the engineering, it has the infrastructure, whether it's ports and railroads, the people power, and it has access to the US market. So what if Canada became the world headquarters of processing of these critical minerals and rare earths that you can dig up anywhere? But what if they're all sent to Canada to process? And in order to do that, in order to get there, you would have to have Canada wanting to do this. And we see provinces from Saskatchewan to Alberta to Quebec and others saying that they want to do this. We have the federal intergovernmental agreement. So you have a basic framework for understanding. Once you have that, then if you have the United States, and particularly the Department of Defense, saying we will provide a guaranteed marketplace, we will buy a certain amount of Canadian-produced critical minerals and rare earths. Now you start to have the market dynamics where private capital would be willing to come in and finance the hundreds of millions of dollars needed. Because if you have essentially guaranteed permitting in a responsible way in partnership with environmental responsibility, indigenous receptivity, all of those things that you do, for example, in the siting of a uranium facility, which Canada is pretty spectacular at, you have that. And then on the other side, you have a guaranteed market, or at least a certain amount of a market. Private capital comes in to help finance these projects. This is the kind of thing that we think would be really helpful. We've had a couple of roundtables on the topic. You can look at the Canadian American Business Council's website for our most recent one, where we talk about how to advance this conversation. And again, I really think your conversation today will be quite rich. I'm sorry that I'm not able to kind of jump in and be part of it live, but I'm happy to do this little scene setter from at least our point of view about why this is so important. The other thing I'll just say in closing is, as Canada thinks about ways that it will be relevant to the United States and ways that it will be relevant on the world stage, this is an area where Canada could really lead. You know, we recently saw Australia and the UK and the United States enter into an agreement that was had to do with nuclear submarines and had to do with our defenses in Asia. And France said, what about us? Canada said, where are we in this picture? Well, if Canada is looking for ways to be extremely important in the global dialogue on security, supply chains, and importantly, carbon transition, this may be one really good way to do it. There's already agreement to do it. The question is, how quickly can we move forward, and can we do it in a way that incentivizes private investment? Because it's really going to take a public-private effort and a cross-border effort for this to really be successful. So again, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing everybody one of these days in person now that the border is reopened or is about to be reopened. So we're excited about that too. Thanks again.
We're really pleased to have Mary Scott's contributions today. She's a real leader, activist leader in sort of promoting Canada-America trade, particularly in the resource sector, and we welcome her observation. I'm delighted now to ask Dirk Nauman, President and CEO of Torgat, to actually address his comments on the role of critical minerals in the Canadian and global economy.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, I want to become a bit more specific on what criticality of minerals and elements means, in particular for the for Canada, and go into specifics about rare earth and how they can be developed or how they will be developed in Canada, in North America, and how we play as a company into it. Yeah, what are critical minerals and metals. If you look at the Canada minerals and metals list, you see 32 minerals mentioned. If you go into more details, we look at more than 50 elements. This is almost the entire periodic table of elements. And a little bit further down on the website of the federal government, you can see the criteria for criticality. Number one is economic importance for Canada. Aluminum, titanium, nickel, definitely potash are very important for our country, and future expansions, future demand in the markets can be supplied out of Canada and continue on to the wealth creation. Number two, and I think this is the focus of today, is which minerals can contribute significantly to the low carbon economies we have to build today as quickly as possible. And these are the minerals going into the electrification of transportation, for instance, power generation, and storage of energy, of electricity. So we are talking about lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and the famous rare earth. I want to focus on the rare earth issue here. Rare earths are everywhere. They were creeping into our lives in the 1980s, 1990s, when they were used in electronics, in magnets, expanded their use as catalysts in the petrochemical and chemical industries. And now they are everywhere. If you look at your cell phone, the colors on your screen are rare earths. If you look at your car, you have, if it's a newer model, you have probably more than 30 rare earth-based magnet motors in your car, from seat adjustment to power steering. Electric cars depends 100% on rare earths for the drivetrain. The forecast for rare earth, even conservative, is factor 5 for the next 10-15 years, with all the car companies launching electric vehicles. And naturally, the battery, where we need the lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and so on, they will grow in the same way. The value of batteries, the price in electric cars, is about 20-30 times higher than the value of the motor. And looking at the rare earth, it's comparably a relatively small part of the cost of the electric vehicle, which unfortunately means that the attention to rare earth in the market, when we discuss about supply chains, about the need of supply chains, is not as apparent and high as for the batteries. There's not as much money in it. But the demand for rare earth, in particular for the magnets, will go to from 3-4 billion today to 15 billion, let's say, in 10-15 years. So there is an incentive to have a closer look these kinds of materials, which are needed anyways. So yeah, permanent rare earth permanent magnet motors. Why are they important? There are so many other motors being developed and being produced and sold today. The key is permanent magnet motors are much more efficient than the induction motors. We are talking about, depending on how you drive your car, for instance, or how you run your wind power facility, we talk about 10-20%. if you want, for instance, in an electric car, replace permanent magnet motors with induction motors, you need a 20% bigger battery, which is very, very expensive. Also, we are talking about additional thousands of dollars for the car. Or you can only drive 20% less. But for the overall sustainability of transportation, we need the most efficient technologies. The issue, and this morning we will go deeper in this issue, is China owns today the rare earth supply chain. China is producing most of the rare earths today, even importing concentrate from other countries, in particular from the US and Myanmar, and the border is opened again. They produce most of the rare earth metal and magnets. They produce most of the motors, and their intention is to produce most of the electric cars. And we are talking, when I say most, we are talking about 80%. So but China will not be able to supply the increased demand, as when I say growth expectations of factor 5 at least. China cannot do this. China is already successfully acquiring new resources and shipping material to the heartland to expand their manufacturing. So what needs to be done? There must be additional rare earth supply, also from mine to processing to metal making to magnet making, introduced around the world. Otherwise, we cannot meet our need for low carbon transportation. And this can be done. Fantastic resources are can be found in Canada, in Australia, and other places of this world. And we need several new large-scale, sustainable, cost-efficient, cost-competitive suppliers into these markets. And I believe that Canada is perfectly suited, in particular Quebec, to meet these requirements. And I would like to, later today in this session, also go into the details how this can be done and how this will be done. Thank you.
That was great, Dirk, and we're going to absolutely come back to this question of how Canada can get from the potential that we have now to sort of the reality of a prominent, if not a world-leading sort of place in the whole critical mineral sector. So thank you very much. It helps enormously to have somebody who's quite literally there at the rock face, talking about how we can make these important strategic transitions. Heather Exner-Perot from Macdonald-Laurier Institute, your thoughts, please.
All right. Well, thanks, Ken, and thanks for having me here. My pleasure to be with Dirk and Dwayne this morning. I might take a slightly more policy or kind of broad perspective. I'm glad to have Dirk on the call, with the kind of the nuts and the bolts of the mineral industry. But just thinking, how do we get here, and what does it all mean? I guess I think for many of us consumers and voters, and I'm a Gen X, we've never faced scarcity. I think there's been really in the Western world just taking for granted that things will show up on your shelves and they'll become increasingly, cheaper, and companies will figure out and the market will figure out. And no matter what policies we put in place, no matter what barriers we put in place, it'll all work out in the end. And I think underinvestment since the last commodity cycle in 2014 and the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, and some trade issues, some global trade issues have all disrupted. And it's a bit of a perfect storm now where we're seeing that we do, there is a government responsibility and interest in ensuring that we do have good supply chains, that we do have the minerals that we need, to maintain our quality of life. And so, and there's a real risk now that we're not going to have that. So some of the, the other big so the supply chains is one of those supply chains, and we'll talk about maybe some onshoring and making sure we have secure sources in North America after, but also thinking about at the same time the expanding demand as we go into the green transformation. And that's obviously the background context of this. We want to get off fossil fuels. So we need to go to wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, whatever. And that is going to take, I think people haven't figured out or haven't considered the extent of the mining that we are going to need to get off of fossil fuels. And of course, there are also environmental impacts of mining. So all, these kinds of factors have not been considered, I think, at a societal level to accept what is going to need to be the investment to get off fossil fuels. I know Dirk mentioned, for example, rare earths is one, and that'll probably have a quintuple of its demand in the next few years. Nickel, I think KPMG said will be about 1,200% increase of our need for demand by 2028. Cobalt, 256% by 2028. Lithium, 575% increase in supply we need. Graphite, 530%. Are these projects online? Mines take some years to develop. So we can see that there will be scarcity, and that our best goals and our best targets are not at this point practicable. And so what can we do to alleviate that? So I guess, we'll try to offer our solutions here, but it's definitely a big problem. It's definitely starting already to affect every inch, every corner of the average person's life. And we're late to this game to really have a plan, I think.
Well, thank you, Heather. The focus on scarcity is a really interesting sort of way of looking at all of this. And it's kind of intriguing because you hear these stories coming out from the sidelines of, there's a slowdown in car production. They're laying off people in Windsor, Ontario. And the main reason is they can't get the supplies necessary. And this goes down the supply chain right to the mining sites. So thank you very, very much for that. It's very, very interesting. Dwayne, your thoughts from London and a sort of perhaps a global perspective on what's going on.
Your mic, Dwayne.
Well, thank you, Ken, for the introduction. I'm joining you today from the UK, which has had a rather extraordinary year, holding the chairmanship of both the G7 and COP26, at which the green transition has dominated public and political discourse. When it comes to climate leadership, in June 2019, the UK emerged as the first major economy in the world to pass legislation committing it to an ambitious net zero emissions target. In November 2020, the UK government announced its 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. If the UK is to achieve its green transition successfully, the UK's integrated review recognises the importance of diversifying and securing its supply of critical minerals. As Canada's allies seek to reduce their dependence on China, Canada has the opportunity to emerge as a global supplier of choice. Let me start by outlining why battery metals and rare earth minerals elements are as important in the 21st century as oil was in the 20th. Rare earths are the building blocks of the green energy revolution, making their way into everything from electric vehicles and battery storage to solar panels and wind turbines. An average electric vehicle uses graphite, copper, nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, and rare earths. The IEA estimates that over the next 2 decades, the demand for lithium will grow 40 times, graphite 25 times, and cobalt and nickel 20 times. Rare earth magnet demand is expected to increase 5-fold by 2030. The EV sector alone is set to increase the demand for rare earths from 5,000 tons in 2019 to 70,000 tons in 2030. Likewise, the wider adoption of solar photovoltaic systems would lead to a surge in demand for copper, cadmium, tellurium, gallium, indium, selenium, silicon, silver, and aluminium that go into solar panels. The wind turbine market is projected to result in roughly 30% of the global growth in the use of rare earth magnets. Rare earths are also the lifeblood of the defense and security sector, from Tomahawk cruise missiles and Predator unmanned aircraft to Lockheed Martin's F-35 Lightning II jets. each of which requires around 418 kilograms of rare earths. Rare earths are also the industrial gold, the high-tech sector is concerned, used in iPhones and iPads, LED screens, microwave filters, superconductors, and digital camera lenses. Yet, the UK, the US, and the EU are nearly completely dependent on China for critical minerals such as rare earth elements. The US depends on China for 80% of its rare earth supply, and the EU depends on China for 98% of its rare earth supply. One must not forget that Asian rare earth producing or processing countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam are also tied to the hip to China, either as exporters or often through Chinese equity. Thus, even if the US and its allies were to boost their domestic production of rare earths, all it takes is for one weak link, represented by inadequate technical capabilities or insufficient project financing, for the entire supply chain to become dependent on China and thus vulnerable to external risk. This is why Canada and its allies in North America, Europe, and the Asia Pacific need to think carefully about pooling together resource intelligence, project finance, and technical capabilities wherever possible to diversify their supply of rare earths and to develop integrated, resilient, reliable, secure, stable, and sustainable critical mineral supply chains. I'm of the opinion that Canada brings a solid amount to the table due to at least three strengths. First, being that it abounds in resources. Canada is among the world's leading producers of battery metals, such as cobalt, graphite, and nickel, and hosts some of the world's largest lithium and rare earth reserves. Canada's second strength is that it excels in sector-related capabilities. Canada's home to half of the world's publicly listed mining and exploration companies. There were more than 3,700 firms in Canada in 2019 able to offer legal, technical, financial, accounting, environmental, and other expertise to companies in the sector. Toronto and Vancouver are global hubs, not just for such professional services, but also equity financing. The Toronto Stock Exchange and the Venture Exchange serve as the world's primary listing venues for mining and exploration companies, with nearly half of all global listings, and with its listed companies raising over half of the world's total equity capital for mining and exploration. A third strength is that Canadian exploration and mining companies are active not just within Canada, but around the world. In 2019, 621 Canadian companies had mining assets abroad, representing around 2/3 of the total value of Canadian mining assets. And Canadian companies operated in 96 countries. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Thank you, Ken.
Dwayne, that was terrific. The reaction I had so far is you've taken sort of my general awareness of this topic from a point of sort of a watching concern and just let's look at managing our resources to actually a little bit of fear. The numbers you're talking about the growth and demand, I'm not sure if I should be running out to phone my stockbroker and say move all my resources into rare earth minerals and critical minerals, because you've certainly given a profile there that's very important. But I think the sense of urgency is real, and we're going to talk about that a lot in the next little while. So Dirk, you actually ended your initial conversations with a real teaser, and you were talking about the fact that Canada and Quebec are particularly well placed, but they have to get their act together. And those are my words, Dirk, not yours. But they have to start moving more strategically and more rapidly. So I wonder, you bring the perspective from the mining companies to make this transition from the resource that's been identified in the field into something where you actually bring it into production and actually ship it off to the manufacturing process. So tell me, Dirk, from a corporate point of view, what can Canada and Quebec do to actually move this along?
Good question. Yeah, we need money, and we can only get money if it's visible to investors, to anyone who wants to engage in this industry, that governments, that regulators, that everyone is more or less is on board and is supporting the strategies to implement these kinds of supply chains. The supply chain for Canada can look like this. We have a couple of world-class deposits. Our Tonga deposit is one of the largest in the world. We distinguish ourselves from others because we have a large concentration of so-called heavy rare earths. These are the really high value and extremely important metals which are needed to make the motor heat resistant. When you drive your electric car up a hill, a long hill in the Rockies, the motor gets really warm. And when you reach the top, the motor still has to work. We need this one. And these materials are already in very short supply. So we have the mining, we have the deposits. We have to build the processing, world-class processing. We cannot just copy what is already there in China and other places. We have to improve and make it cost competitive and absolutely best sustainability. The ESG is absolutely fundamental. I believe we know how to do this. Then when we have the individual rare earths, we have to convert it into metal. This is the missing link in the supply chain. Basically, only China is converting rare earths today into metal. NRCan already commissioned studies, projects to figure out how to convert into metal, what are the economics. And in these studies, the proposal is Canada should engage the right people, the right companies in Canada already, like the aluminum companies, Hydro-Quebec, and so on, also to develop the metal making in time with the development of rare earth mining and processing. And then there's a huge open field for magnet making. As soon as metal is available, we can attract magnet makers. There's know-how out there in this world, and companies who would love to come to Canada with their technology directly or in the form of license, like Shinetsu or Hitachi or these kinds of companies. And then in North America, we already have lots of motor makers. Dana in Quebec is there, and then the motor goes. There is a vision we share with the federal government, in particular with the Quebec government, about how to move forward. But currently, this is more conversation in meeting rooms. It has to come out into the public that that investors and others really are aware and push this exciting opportunity that we have here. And again, as I want to emphasize, we can do this cost competitive, sustainable, and supply a significant amount of material into the North American supply chain or into the European supply chain or to Japan. And expansion is no issue. There's plenty of space to grow in Canada.
Very promising, Dirk. Thank you very much for that. I mean, quite honestly, in the current economic situation, we don't very often hear these too many stories of areas where there's opportunities for exponential growth. Particularly in the resource sector, where the oil and gas industry has been sort of tied down and constrained, and you're now talking about this enormous opportunity. So, Dwayne, let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. When you look at the kind of development you're talking about, is this a short-term bubble or is this a long-term need? When you look at these kind of deficiencies, you think, okay, maybe that's one or two small mines and everything's all solved. The percentages sound enormous, but the percentages might be off a fairly small base. And in fact, we could be seeing a quick jump and then a sort of a stasis where it just sort of levels off for the next 20 or 30 years. So short-term challenge, long-term opportunity. How would you describe it, the reality?
Well, thank you for the question, Ken. I think it's important to bear in mind here that the issue is one not just of supply, but also capabilities. The big challenge here is processing. So even if we were to have supply from various sources, it's fair to reprocess the rare earths in order to meet the domestic demand in Canada and its allies. I gave you the statistic earlier for the IEA's estimates. The EU as well, commissioned a study in 2020, which noted that the demand for rare earths used in permanent magnets would increase 10 times in 2050. And the EU itself would require 18 times more lithium and 5 times more cobalt in 2030, and 60 times more lithium and 15 times more cobalt in 2050. And this is only for electric battery storage and electric vehicles. So when it comes to it, if say in America, if President Biden is to achieve his goal, that 50% of all cars in the US sold in the US in 2030 will be zero emission electric vehicles, the US is going to require 10 times the amount of rare earths that it currently has. Again, I said earlier, rare earth magnet demand is expected to increase fivefold by 2030, but that would result in shortages from 22 onwards of around 48,000 tons of NdPr, which is sort of neodymium praseodymium, which goes into the permanent magnet alloy, and around 16,000 tons of NdPr oxide. So this, it's not just a supply demand issue, it's also about deficiencies and capabilities and securing supply.
Very, very encouraging. So now Heather's going to solve a problem for us, if you don't mind, Heather. And the Honorable Wayne Easter has joined us as well and has asked the very same question I was going to ask you right now about what does government do about this? The issues obviously are about mining. That involves approval processes. It involves financing for these mines and what have you. But it also involves, and Dirk made the same point, and so is Dwayne, that it's not just about getting the material out of the ground. It's about capitalizing on and capturing the processing side. That obviously, from everything we've heard so far, that if Canada can capture the processing side, this is a major economic opportunity. And I want to just go back to something that Dirk said. It's not just, again, about getting the minerals into sort of usable form and into the supply chain. It's about entering Canada into the supply chain in a major way as manufacturers of some of these high-end, high-value products that are going to be crucial in the global sort of transition toward a more carbon-free or less carbon-intensive environment. So, Heather, solve it for us. What should the government do?
Well, that's such an easy question because the answer is maybe government should get out of the way a little bit more, and that would solve a lot of problems. And, and not to steal any of Dirk's thunder, and certainly he could weigh in on this, but when I hear from investors, their challenges in Canada, they're multiple. And as Dirk said, what this problem needs is money. It needs investment. And the mining and the resource development, kind of extractive sector has been underinvested in for about the last 7-8 years. We all know that. So now, and markets can adjust. And now we're going to a different cycle, and maybe there'll be more money. Probably more money will flow into it. But from an investor perspective, it's, you can think, well, are we going to invest in Canada or Australia or Africa? Those are considerations. But the other consideration for a fund or a pension is, should we invest in mining or should we invest in, Tesla or batteries or vehicles or other kinds of manufacturing or food products? They aren't, so mining as a sector is taking, especially in Canada, is taking a lot of risk. It's getting a slow timeline to get your money back, and has steady but maybe not fantastic returns. So it's not always an attractive sector for investors, and we have to make it more attractive. Now in Canada, I guess, what should government do? I guess the frustrating part probably is that we know what to do. There have been studies. Industry Canada has led these studies. So the challenge is that Industry Canada, with, in its conversations with mining sector, is the declining competitiveness. In Canada, I think, just in general, on a business competitive kind of a rating. I think we were 4th in 2006, and now we're 28th, according to, I think it's the OECD. If we look at the Fraser Institute, does a great annual survey of mining companies. It looks at your geological potential. Canada is tremendous on the geological potential, and yes, we're lucky to be in that situation. But on the policy perception, we've been declining there. It does not look like a great friendly jurisdiction for a lot of investment money. And so we're seeing, a big complaint is the timeline to get approvals and to get permits. Other things that Industry Canada has said that it knows it needs to solve is the trade uncertainty created by lack of access to existing and new markets, uncertainty around land-based and land use decision-making. And I'll talk about kind of Indigenous issues later and their involvement. But there's other land use decision-making processes there too. Insufficient infrastructure. And Dwayne knows this too from his work in the Arctic. We have a lot of land, we have a lot of potential, but everything, that's kind of out of the norm is probably 3 times higher to develop, in the territories than it would be in Southern Canada, for example. So the further out you get, the more expensive it gets to develop. Declining Canadian foreign investment in resource projects because of the high project development costs, a demographic imbalance in resource jobs. We had a boom. A lot of people left that workforce in the extractive industries in the last 10 years because it wasn't a bust cycle. How are we going to get that labor back? Lack of agility and technology adoption. All these things we know, we've identified. And then the question is, what are we going to do about it? So, some things that I think have been counterproductive, that maybe have been positive on one aspect, but not positive on investment in mining, is the Impact Assessment Act that was passed. People know it as C-69 perhaps. And it maybe you've seen as a No More Pipelines bill, but obviously it had huge implications for all kinds of resource extraction. And again, just adds a little bit more layer of uncertainty and a little bit more layer of risk that makes it harder to attract investment into Canada. So, removing that uncertainty and people understanding what does the IIA mean, what does it mean for timelines, what does it mean for consultation is very important. And then the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People legislation, which we've had a whole other separate webinar devoted to, but again adds one more risk where for a resource extraction company, now it looks like there's a legislative requirement to consent, but there was no definition of consent. It doesn't know who you need to consult with. Is the chief and council sufficient? Do you need to consult with the whole community? Do you need to consult with hereditary chiefs? None of that is clear, which just means there's more risk for your investment and longer timelines to get a return on your investment, and money will go elsewhere. Even though we all know we need these products, if it can get better money in a faster time somewhere else, then the money will go to that place. So those are some of the, what can government do is not make it so hard, I guess, not make so many disincentives to investing in the Canadian mining sector.
Well, thanks, Heather, and thanks to all of you for now making me depressed. So, the opening sessions are talking about the phenomenal opportunities, the global demand, the unique opportunities for Canada. The fact that, we always have this standard observation that Canada's a hewer of wood and drawer of water. We're a natural resource economy, and we stop there. And what Dirk and Dwayne have said very clearly, and Heather, I think you agree, is that in the case of critical minerals or rare earths, we could go much further because of our potential control and prominent role both in production and in manufacturing. We could actually establish a whole new set of companies on that high value chain, sort of part of the supply enterprise, which is going to be really, really exciting to see. And so all right, let's get more pragmatic here. And Dirk, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to ask a question that I had here, but Lauren has asked this as well. So all right, Dirk, you're in the front lines of all of this. What do you need from government in terms of policy and regulation? Clearly, environmental issues are absolutely vital. You want to create more of a problem, well, you solve another one. And as Heather's already said, we'll come back to this more, Indigenous people have to be involved in a productive and positive sort of way. Those are not off the table. Those are right central on the table. But Dirk, what can be done in a policy level, both provincial, territorial, and federal? So what can be done at a policy level that will actually free up the industry to capitalize on an extremely rare opportunity?
You're muted still, Dirk.
Would be great if I had all the answers to these policy questions. what you already mentioned, we are working very close, trying to work very closely with the provincial and federal governments. Also, the provincial government has the jurisdiction for the mining. We finally, Quebec and the federal government published their critical metals and minerals policies. When you read these documents, it's basically a wish list and call to action. We need the action, which are formulated in all these documents. Also from clarifying to everyone also what is desired. For instance, what is critical in the rare earths. We are not only mining. If we would produce a concentrated, ship it to China, we would lose money. It's not. It cannot be done. We have to go into the added value steps, into the processing, making the separate the individual rare earths, and then we talk about really good margins and creating added value and have a significant social impact in employment and opportunities downstream. I cannot see how any regulatory support for these kinds of things. Working with the indigenous groups, they are much more advanced and involved and engaged in what we are doing because they see the direct advantage. So not only royalties or what they get out of the impact benefit agreement, it's about creating businesses and a future for the indigenous communities on the James Bay, on the territory of the James Bay Agreement, and further south in Schefferville, for instance, or over there in Labrador. There's a I can give you no. Let me keep the answer like this. I hope it's good enough for the time being.
It was very good, Dirk, and it's interesting. There's sort of an undertone of frustration here, where it's almost like a swimmer who's almost to the edge of the pool. The edge of the pool keeps getting further away. Where we got a neat opportunity here. What is really fascinating about the comments and the things you've shared together so far, before I come back to you, Dwayne, with another sort of question, is that we're actually talking here about the juxtaposition between what we would call in Canada typically the old economy and the new economy. We have a rather disparaging national perception about mining. I think mining is one of the most important parts of the Canadian economy. It has been for generations. It is a huge part of our global competitive advantage. We should be celebrating it at sort of every possible turn. And we tend to sort of allow the critics to sort of drive it down a little bit, and perhaps too much. But what you're all saying is that you will not have a new economy unless you have this traditional resource economy. And you will actually miss out on many of the opportunities for Canada and for North America. And so that's very disturbing, because in fact, everybody's so excited about renewables. They're so excited about electric vehicles. They're so excited about solar panels. And yet you can't build those things unless you have the core minerals behind them. So Dwayne, you have this wonderful global view that I know you travel the world and have your fingers out in different countries and different areas around the world. Where are Canada's competitors? We've talked a lot about China. Are there other places where these minerals are found? And are there other places where we should be sort of watching as competitors that might steal our opportunity?
I'm going to unmute myself first this time. So when it comes to, it's useful to think about it in terms of reserves and production. So when it comes to reserves, yes, China's firmly in the lead. Say in rare earths, 44 million metric tons of the estimated world reserves of 120 million metric tons is in China. So that's about 36.7%. But then China's followed by Brazil, Vietnam, Russia, India, and Australia. The US holds around 1.5 million metric tons, which is around 1.25% of the world's rare earth reserves. Greenland sits on a very large amount. My report earlier this year, called for, made note of the fact that of the 41 companies that held licenses in Greenland's mineral sector, 27, the clear majority, were firms that were British, Canadian, and Australian. This is despite all the media hullabaloo about American involvement in Greenland. The three major players economically in Greenland are still Britain, Canada, and Australia. And so again, another thing to think about is how does Canada not just engage with Canadian firms within Canada, but also in the mining, in the rare earth space in Greenland, in the US, and elsewhere. Domestically, Canada is estimated to have around 830,000 tons of rare earth reserves, which makes it a fairly large actor. Now, when it comes to rare earth production, the global production, again, is dominated by China, which accounts for sort of 58.33% of global production. China is followed by the US with around 16%, Myanmar with around 12.5%, Australia with around 7.1%. And then you have this range of countries, Madagascar, India, Russia, Thailand, Vietnam, Brazil, Burundi, that all account collectively for around 7.6%. Canada was not a producer so far, but more recently, I think just in June, a Canadian rare earth project near Yellowknife in Northwest Territories has commenced production. This makes the National Art Show project the second rare earth producer in North America and the first in Canada.
Those are not the countries we typically think of. When you start running off Madagascar and Myanmar and putting them in that context, it demonstrates several things, Dwayne, how tremendously global this is, and quite frankly, how the money is going to follow the opportunity. Clearly, if we've got Canadian companies very actively involved, as you say, in Greenland, Canada, I always find this astonishing. Canadians simply underestimate the phenomenal global footprint of Canadian mining companies and the Canadian service companies. This is not just about the actual extractors of the resources. It's about the engineers and the designers, the environmental scientists. It's about the social, relationship building people. We've got this phenomenal capability in Canada that, ironically, is being used perhaps more outside the country than inside, which is really quite fascinating. So, Heather, just to turn this back to you a bit, you've talked about the fact that you want government out of the way, or the government has to sort of be clear that it's a major part of the problem in this process. Think a little bit, if you don't mind, about the Canada-U.S. relationship here. We're best buddies, except when we're not. And we've had some interesting patterns over the time of sort of really good relations. And then we have people like Barry Scott, who are doing a phenomenal job of building these kinds of ties. But what does that relationship look like on the policy front? And what more can we do to sort of improve the situations there?
Good question. And I'll get to it. First, I'm going to go back, when you mentioned hewers and haulers, and I think this relates to the question. I don't think people appreciate, that it's not just grunt work to have an $8 billion mine, like the phenomenal engineering capability that goes in it. Like you said, it's a huge financial business, mining that Canada has. The labor productivity, I think the average labor productivity for all sectors across Canada is $53 or $54. I think for mining, it's double that, $120, $130 an hour labor productivity per worker. And for oil and gas extraction, it's like $600. So these resource extracted industries by far have the best bang for buck in terms of labor productivity. And yes, we want to move down the value chain and add some manufacturing. Of course we do. But there's even just capturing more mining productivity and activity would be phenomenal. In terms of the relationship with the United States, and Mary, mentioned in the beginning that we have now this MOU on securing critical minerals and the supply chain. And I think one of the, mega trends that we're going to see after COVID is more onshoring, that obviously there are more fault lines in a global supply chain than maybe we appreciated, or maybe that we have the appetite now to stomach. And the more that you can do, kind of closer within a North American context, for example, rather than relying on Asia or Africa for some of your very critical components, the better off we'll be. So I think, for the United States, obviously looking up north and all that space and all that geographical potential, that's just purely obvious. And I think for Canada, that's also mutually beneficial. We have a huge guaranteed market. The logistics of getting it there are less difficult. So in as much as we can do that, I think that's good. When you first posed that question before, what I also thought about though was the 1977 pipeline treaty that has been, this is maybe getting the minutiae, but with the Line 5 going through Michigan and the Michigan governor threatening to cut it off. This made me think of that. That 1977 pipeline treaty came about during the energy crisis of the 1970s after OPEC, kiboshed oil exports, to North America and caused that huge energy crisis then. And then there was a concerted effort to make North America energy independent. And the oil sands and the shale revolution have actually accomplished that. Now, North America is a net exporter of oil and gas instead of an importer. And so the precedent has been established that, yes, if North America gets its act together, it can become independent in a lot of these kind of resource development needs. But there has to be political certainty. For Canada, if we're going to put our eggs in the American economy basket, then I think there also needs to be political certainty for us that they're going to be a reliable producer, and there won't be some, concerted effort to say, oh, this mine is bad, so we're not going to import anything from that mine. We're not going to allow it to cross, a railroad into the United States. I mean, you can see those things start up, or the potential for them, because they're happening now with oil and gas. And then I hope we get, I'll stop there for now, but the social license question of American and Canadian voters and consumers accepting that there are environmental impacts of mining, but it's a trade-off with going to a low-carbon economy.
That's actually a really, really critical question about sort of the public acceptance of it. The public's very accepting of electronic vehicles and cell phones and solar panels. But quite frankly, I think in North America, we prefer to have that work actually done in South America or Asia or Africa. We don't, the not in my backyard scenario is quite strong. So Dirk, how capable is the Canadian mining industry of responding to this opportunity if the barriers are lowered to an appropriate level? Is the Canadian mining industry able to take this on? This is a huge transition that could lead to an economic transformation in many parts of the country, particularly outside the major cities where a lot of that transformation is urgently needed. So are the miners ready to go?
Absolutely, and it's not only a mining issue. Also, I believe mining is the smallest part in the entire supply chain. Canada has so much experience in drilling some holes in the rock and blasting the rock and bring it to the right place as a concentrate. So this is what we do since 100 years as a business. The next steps, which I believe is more important, is the processing. For rare earth, I see rare earth processing or rare earth production more as a specialty chemicals business than a mining business. And we work with the top technology companies in this world, the top engineering companies who know how to do this, who have a track record and doing this successfully. So we are working with companies like Metso Autotech and with headquarters in Finland, and we are using their facilities in Germany and in Finland. We are working with the top company in separation of rare earths, a company in France. We are working with another companies that are doing our beneficiation optimization in Germany. So we have access to the world leading technologies and knowledge, and will bring it into the country. It definitely can be done, and it will be done. These the industries are so interconnected internationally that I don't see an issue. And Canada will only benefit from bringing in all the expertise and knowledge.
You make a very, very good case for that. Dwayne, I'm going to drop a question on you that I hadn't suggested before, but it's come to us in the chat from a number of different people. What role does recycling play in rare earth minerals and critical minerals generally? Are we at sort of a fairly advanced stage internationally of being able to capitalize on the opportunities of recycling and reusing these materials multiple times?
The answer is going to be yes. Recycling is an option. I don't think recycling is going to be a substitute for finding new sources. I mean, I think the EU put out a report a little while ago, a few years ago, saying, recycling is going to be the answer, but it doesn't take away from finding new sources, whether it's, looking at Greenland or, I know that particular report looked also at deep sea mining for rare earths. But having said that, Canada has shown enormous potential in this area. The Canadian firm Geomega Resources has said it's building the world's first sustainable rare earths recycling facility. It's going to be outside Montreal. So I wish them the very best, and I'm curious to see how it's all going to unfold.
Well, let's hope it unfolds very, very nicely. Heather, I want to go back to your comment you made sort of at the end of your last observations about sort of the social license and particularly about the question of the relationship with indigenous peoples. If Canada has been overregulated, perhaps in some areas, according to your observations, and I'd agree with those, it seems to me that one of the things we're doing better than almost any country in the world is developing those constructive, positive relationships with indigenous peoples. I was always impressed with so many First Nations across the country, but in northern Saskatchewan with uranium, in northwest British Columbia with the Tahltan First Nation people, very good, productive relationships with the mining sector. The idea that mining is something that is shoved down the throats of indigenous communities, it's kind of an old trope, I think. It doesn't really apply so much anymore. But this, nonetheless, mines take place typically in rural areas. They're areas where indigenous people are the dominant parts of the population. What do you say about the sort of achievement of social license, both at the local level, but also at the national, international level? I mean, how do you get people to agree that this is an essential part of the economic renewal in the 21st century?
I'll tackle the indigenous portion first, and then that'll probably take me a few minutes, so we might have to come back to the whole social license. But on the indigenous side, yes, Canada is doing better. And when I say things like the UNDRIP legislation opens up question marks, the Impact Assessment Act opens up question marks, it does. And I think part of the problem is that nations are different, territories are different. There isn't really a one-size-all approach, but that makes it very difficult from a mining or an investor perspective. Now, mining is a lot better to get social license to negotiate impact and benefit agreements, because usually the number of nations affected is much smaller than a linear project. So a pipeline is obviously, you might have to deal with 100 different nations, and it's very hard to get consent with that many. But with the mine, it might only be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 nations that you have to deal with. It's often a longer term project, 20 or 30 or 40 years. And so you can take the time to build that relationship and negotiate a good agreement. So I think there is better potential for mining to develop those relationships. Everyone's on board now. Any smart miner is on board with that and has processes and has good indigenous relations staff and that kind of thing. So I think the future is bright from that perspective. But often the goalposts are still getting changed at a regulatory kind of level, and so there just needs to be more clarity. I think if companies could just say these are the hurdles we have to jump, they'll figure out a way to jump them. But when you go back and change the hurdles, that's where the problems start to arise. I think equity ownership is that's what everyone's talking about now. So it used to be the impact and benefit agreement that might have had some royalties or revenues or guaranteed employment. That's still part of it. But I think going forward, there'll be more equity deals. And then indigenous nations will really have a stake in the success of the mine. And that will be good for everybody. So there's that. But on the other hand, and Dwayne knows this, there is still a lot of tension, and then we can get to kind of the broader societal acceptance, but it's still hard to get mining done. So there's two big things that happened this year that I think are warning signs, or we should pay attention to. One is the St. Mary's iron ore mine in Nunavut on Baffin Island. And that isn't a critical mineral on the list that Canada has, but it still goes to show that you can have a huge investment, mostly have public acceptance. And now as they're going into a phase 2, which as I understand was going to be the profitable phase, phase 1, I think, was money losing. Then there's been opposition because of dust, and that's affecting hunting and trapping in the area. And over the summer, I think there's a blockade of the airstrip, and the hearings have become very political and very polarizing in Nunavut. And that just goes to show that from an investment perspective, even when you're operating, even when you're exporting, there's still risk that can come down the line. Things can still turn around for you. And Dwayne will know in Greenland, a uranium mine, there was uranium planning. It was, getting quite close. And the entire last Greenland election was basically a referendum on, do we want uranium mining or don't we? And the answer was no. The party that was opposed to uranium mining won, and now there'll likely be a moratorium on uranium mining. So from an investor perspective, when you're saying we're going to go into these expensive places, we're going to do the consultation, it will take years to get to point A, point B. Well, with the new election, all that work can still be overturned. Another example, lithium mine that we're seeing in Nevada. Of course, we need lithium for the green transformation, but this was on some sacred lands, and the indigenous tribes in that area were opposed to it. So there are still high risks involved in a lot of these processes.
So we really keep coming back around to the complexity of this issue. This is not, we know the supply is there, we know the demand is there, we know the need is there. We have government policies that may or may not be encouraging and discouraging things. We have indigenous issues, social license issues, very complex. So one of our listeners, George, has asked a question about, and Dirk, I'm going to direct this one to you. How do we ensure that the environmental costs that are incurred once a mine is closed are not passed on to government? There's a huge issue in the Yukon Northwest Territories where the cost of fixing up mines from the 1930s, 1960s, and 70s actually greatly exceeds the economic value of those mines to the local population. And so there's a really front and center sort of issue. Are there any particular elements to the rare earth or the critical minerals side about this particular question, or is this a generic question about the mining sector?
I see this as a generic question. In the regulations, when you start your environmental impact assessment and provide the project description, one important chapter you have to provide is remediation and closure of mines. And with a permit to operate a mine, you also have to put aside money already, cash, to guarantee that when you cease operation, that everything can be done as required. And I'm 100% in favor of these kinds of approach. The beauty of our deposit at Strange Lake, we want to explore this. This deposit is so big, it will run for 100 years. It's like Sudbury. The permits go usually for 30 years, which is a reasonable timeline. Also looking at our lifespan. But the overall opportunity goes forever. But again, I'm 100% in favor of making sure that when things finish, you don't leave unfinished business.
And again, Dirk, that's a really good example of how much the industry has changed in recent years. I've been a huge admirer of what the mining industry in Canada has done in recent times. When Bill C-69 came out, and Heather will remember this conversation, the Canadian mining industry generally was actually, accepting of it. I'm not sure if support is the right word, but they certainly came out publicly and said, yes, we can live with this. And when I spoke to people in the Canadian Mining Association, why are you doing that? Why are you accepting this additional regulation? And the comment that came back was kind of interesting was, well, we're already doing most of the things they're talking about. In fact, in some places, we've gone beyond what the new legislation actually requires. And so the mining industry appears to have sort of understood this. Dwayne, let me put you back on a geopolitical level. If you don't mind. Bryce, who's listening today, asked us a question about this. And I want you to scope us out for what this might look like. And you've been really good, all three of you have been really good about talking about the potential here. But let's assume the government of Canada changes course and the provinces and territories come on board. Critical mineral industry sort of starts to expand, and Canada starts to rival China. What does that mean for Canada? And what does that mean for North America? I mean, is this a minor blip on the economic scale? Is it a transformative enterprise? What scale and what impact would this actually have in Canada and the United States?
Well, I think it's really important to think about the complexity, as we've done already. But the answer to the complexity lies in collaboration and integration. When I spoke earlier about supply chains, global supply chains, that's the framework we really need to use in order to think about securing critical mineral supply. And when we think about global supply chains, the key emphasis must be on how do we integrate different capabilities among sort of allied countries. So the report I wrote earlier this year was calling for a Five Eyes Critical Minerals Alliance, which argued about why Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK must really pool together the resources, resource intelligence, technical capabilities, project finance, but also when it comes to, again, on the subject of integrated supply chains, what I do see happening in the North American context and welcome greatly is the integrated supply chains being formed between Canada and the US. Not every stage of the supply chain needs to be fulfilled domestically. It may happen to have capabilities in America that Canada can rely on, and vice versa. When it comes to the supply of battery materials, Canada abounds in them, and Canada can be the supplier to the US. I'll give you an example in the European context, and coming back to Heather's point about Greenland. One of the big projects in Greenland, the one that does not have uranium, is run by a company called Tanbreeze, an Australian firm. There's no controversy surrounding this project because of its very low, thorium or uranium content. Now, in the UK, Greenland does not have processing or separation capabilities at the moment. It's not even producing. But come to the UK, we have three very important developments in recent years. We have an Australian firm, now a British firm, called Pensana, setting up a rare earth processing facility in Hull. We have another Australian firm called Peak Resources that announced they're going to develop a rare earth refinery in Teesside. And then we have a company called Less Common Metals in Cheshire on the other side. And Less Common Metals is the largest metal manufacturer, rare earth metal manufacturer outside Japan or China. What we need to think about doing now is how do we take these different capabilities and integrate them into one supply chain? So the possibility arises of bringing in raw ore from Greenland. Maybe you could do the sorting in Greenland. You could do the upgrading in either Pensana's facility. Now, Pensana's facility is going to cater mainly to rare earths coming in from their project in Angola, but that has a limited, mine life. So again, they're open to the idea of having a multi-user facility in Hull. So again, bring down ore from Greenland, sort it in Greenland, upgrade it in Hull or Teesside, then ship it over. Either Pensana and Peak decide to go all the way and have a larger supply chain all the way mine to magnet, or you can even move it across to Cheshire, where it can be made into metals. So there are many opportunities arising. The same thing can be seen in Canada, where you have Yellowknife, you have Netalache project producing rare earths now. Those rare earths can be sorted in Yellowknife, sorted in Netalache. They could be sent over to Saskatchewan to the new rare earth processing facility being built by Saskatchewan Research Council. I think it's going to be completed in 2022. Again, that thread could be upgraded. From there, it could go forward. I know the Canadian firm Search Metals also has some sort of, partnership with a US rare earth firm developing the Round Top project in Texas. Already we are seeing the structures in place of integrated supply chains being developed bilaterally with Greenland, UK, with Canada, US. It's time for us to think about how do we, as allies, integrate all of them so we can develop sustainable, stable, secure supply chains. That's really where the future lies, because the complexity otherwise is way, way too great for any single ally to solve single-handedly.
Dwayne, that was a brilliant description of the sort of a network production sort of process. And the part, and you didn't leave it out because you mentioned it earlier on, is the fact that these are minerals that have very strategic importance, both strategic economically, but strategic in military terms and in terms of the security of our energy systems and what have you. And so it's not just a good thing to do because that would be nice for economic opportunities. It's also a necessary thing to do in order to sort of create a 21st century sustainable economy. And I think those two things together work very, very well. I'm going to pick up on Dwayne's thing, and Dirk, and send it back to you here. You're doing this great job of tantalizing us by saying, I'll tell you more about this if you ask. So I'm going to come back and ask. You were talking about the mine that you're actually developing. I think you said Straight Lake. This is a 100-year mine. 100-year mines are very rare in Canada. They have huge economic implications. If you look at the Sudbury mine, if you look at Boise Bay isn't a 100-year mine, but it's a substantial one. If you look at Cameco in northern Saskatchewan, these long-term mines actually can really recast the area in very positive ways. So talk us through what's stopping your mine from going forward, or tell us where it's at, and tell us what has to be done to accelerate that process. You have to click your mute button.
Yeah, we are involved in continued conversations with large investors. I hope it will come to fruition soon, but the contract is, or financing is done when it's done. The so-called Strange Lake deposit is geologically a complex, about 4 or 5 kilometer in diameter. There are 2 areas which show outcrops of the rare earths, and these 2 areas have been explored and drilled to quite some extent. The area where we want to build our open pit is just a small blob of the entire complex, and this blob is good for more than 30 years, also almost 100 years, as of looking at the projected capacity. But we already did lots of work, in particular this season, looking at drill cores and geology and mineralogy over the overall complex. And we have the evidence that the geological structure is almost identical over a huge region to our open pit target. The issue is that there are a few meters of granite on top of the rare earth domains. So it's definitely a huge deposit, good for many years, and can be expanded, and also the necessary infrastructure can be expanded. Now the big question is, the next big question is, how do this in a sustainable way? So we can build big roads and big ports, and let's say on the Atlantic coast, going through Labrador. But we don't want to do this. If we can avoid it, we definitely want to leave the least environmental impact possible. And yeah, we have means and partners to go this direction.
Very promising development. So, folks, we've done a wonderful job of going through the issues. We're going to ask one more question to Heather. Just a heads up to all three of you that when Heather's finished, I'm going to come back in our order of Dirk, Dwayne, and Heather to tell us your 1, 2, or 3 sort of kind of urgent policy needs. That if you're talking to a bunch of politicians and civil servants and corporate officials and journalists and whatever on this call, tell us 1, 2, or 3 things you think have to be done. So first, Heather, to you to sort of wrap it up, if you don't mind. I'm really interested in your thoughts on sort of the green transformation and mining. Ironically, we often see these things as in opposition, but if this call has had any impact on anybody at all, it should be seen that the green transformation actually requires this. And how do you get the public to sort of bring their minds around this relationship that the green transformation will require a rapid and dramatic acceleration in Canadian mining in critical minerals and rare earths? So your thoughts on this, Heather?
That's what I don't think we have had a public discussion and grappled on this publicly. If we want to have net zero by 2050, and we all want that, then we need to replace the 80% of our energy sources that comes from fossil fuels. And that is an almost impossible task, just if we had unlimited money, because of, again, the logistics of doing that. But when you still take 10 years to open up a mine and to get its approval, then 2050 looks very close and very soon. And so I think there's an idea that the green transformation is going to be an environmental Shangri-La, and maybe, and certainly greenhouse gases is one aspect of protecting the environment, but it's going to require a replacement of a different kind of resource extraction. And so that is what I don't think we have grappled with, that people appreciate, that replacing fossil fuels with mining products is going to have environmental impact. And that if we want to do it by 2050, if we think net zero is the primary goal, then we need to accept that. And we're not seeing it. We're not seeing like hydroelectric, hydro projects have opposition, transmission projects have opposition, lithium projects have opposition, solar farms have opposition. We are not going to transition by 2050 until we accept that there will be some costs to having that rapid transition. And we're not even talking about that yet. And nuclear is another one where maybe you were starting to see, a bit of a turn in the sentiment that people are starting to say, maybe we do need nuclear. But again, those take, it takes time to build, nuclear reactors. It takes time to build up the supply and the security of that. So we are not moving fast enough whatsoever if we want to get to net zero by 2050. And we're going to have to start to choose, what are our priorities and what are we willing to compromise and accept on?
Well, thank you for a wonderful sort of call to collective arms, I guess, is sort of your last observation, Heather. Thank you very much for that. So here you're now policy mavens. You're all going to give us your wonderful 1 or 2 or 3 really quick hits on what we should do. So you had about a minute each. So Dirk, to you first.
Okay, I would like to emphasize what we don't need. In Europe, it's always a discussion about, when you talk about rare earth supply chain or raw materials supply chain, about subsidies. We don't need subsidies. We know we can be cost competitive after startup. We don't need a VAT refund. Chinese rare earth manufacturers, magnet manufacturers get their VAT refunded for domestic use, and everyone else has to pay 15% on top of it. We don't need this. But we need something like Australia. Australia has a very concise critical metals strategy, and they are executing, including financing the difficult phase going to the bankable feasibility study. We don't want the money as a gift. Also, we're happy to pay it back afterwards. But something specific and concrete, hopefully, will be done in the future.
Thanks very much, Dwayne. At that geopolitical level that you always sort of bring to bear on these conversations, what are the 2 or 3 policy things you think should be done?
Right. So number one, I second follow Australia's lead in setting up a critical minerals facilitation office that can serve as a focal point for government, industry, and other stakeholders, and that with Austrade promotes investment opportunities in critical minerals projects. Also, follow Australia's lead in setting up a major projects facilitation agency. Number 2, develop a Five Eyes, and New Zealand is not interested, AUKUS, Canada, AUKUS, Critical Minerals Alliance, to enhance collaboration on resource intelligence, project finance, and technical expertise, and bring in all interested Five Eyes actors in initiatives such as the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative or the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. Number 3, align public sector funding and financing mechanisms, such as Export Development Canada, Export Finance Australia, UK Export Finance, US Exim Bank, New Zealand Export Credit Office, and other government funding and financing mechanisms, and eliminate all discrimination within the US national technological and industrial base that already brings together the US, UK, Canada, Australia, with the US ensuring that critical minerals projects that ultimately benefit the US should be eligible for DFC, Exim, DOE, and DOD funding, no matter where they be operating, and encourage all parties in the alliance to have reciprocal frameworks if necessary. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Ken.
I leave it to that. That's a transformation of the industry in one quick 40-second burst. Dwayne, that was quite brilliant. Thank you very, very much. Heather, your policy prescriptions for an integration of mining and the green transformation.
Great. I'll focus maybe more on the Canadian context. I think we need to make Canadian mining more attractive to investors and reduce the risks. So making the Impact Assessment Act, more practical, faster permitting times, just moving at much more at the pace of business and the pace of reaching net zero. Indigenous equity, funding Indigenous equity, making sure that there's capital available at good costs for Indigenous nations so they can be owners, have equity interests in new mines so that they feel like partners and give their consent to these things and speed it up that way. And finally, having that conversation about social license, preparing people for the fact that we will have to have more resource extraction that may not be fossil fuel based, but certainly will have some impacts on the environment. And we need to not have a knee-jerk reaction that corporations are bad and resource extraction is bad and we want to stop this kind of thing and conserve it, but have a knee-jerk reaction that some urgent action is needed, and this is the path forward if we want to have sustainable, affordable, reliable energy globally.
Well, the three of you and Scotty as well, who wasn't able to be with us for the whole time, have been absolutely brilliant. You've taken a very complex issue, you've made it way more complicated. But you've been very clear about the fact that we need to act, and we need to act in a constructive and creative way, that the mining industry is not antithetical to the green transformation. In fact, it's integral to the green transformation. That there are ways of building relationships with communities, Indigenous peoples in particular, that could make this into a nation-building enterprise of the highest order. I'm very, very struck with the way in which you've talked, a very sophisticated way you talked about how Canada can integrate itself with its allies first, and then with the global supply chain more generally, that we can actually turn this into a sort of an alliance-building enterprise that has so many critically important security issues, but also economic sort of issues. Folks, thank you all for joining us today. I want to express my thanks on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to our panelists, Mary Scott Greenwood, from the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian American Business Council, Heather Exner-Perot from Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Heather, thank you very much. Dirk, thank you very much. Dirk Nauman, President and CEO of Torngat. I wish you all the best in getting your mine into appropriate production and as quickly as we possibly can see it going forward. And Dwayne Menzies, you've been a wonderful analyst as always, bringing a global perspective to bear on really important Canadian issues. This has been a wonderful webinar, a wonderful conversation about a critical national and international issue. On behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I thank our panelists today, thank our questioners for sending in your wonderful questions, and thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. So long, everybody.
Bye.